My name's Tim Haines. I'm producer of the Walking with Dinosaurs specials. I started with making programs about dinosaurs about 5 years ago with Walking with Dinosaurs, which was our first program that used computer graphic dinosaurs and creatures. And we went on to make Walking with Beasts. And then we thought it was time for a change, and we started to make these programs, which have a presenter in them. And I made one of them, and Jasper made another one.
I'm Jasper James. I made the special, which is about the biggest dinosaurs of all time. I'm also in the process of making a sort of mini-series about sea monsters, which is a journey through time, goes way, way, way back, and looks at really the worst times ever to get in the water.
I think sometimes people have an idea that there were some dinosaurs, and Walking with Dinosaurs did tell you about an awful lot, about 35, 40 I think it was, and they kind of feel that's very complete, that's told them all they need to know about dinosaurs. But in fact it's a little pinprick. There are thousands and thousands of interesting and fascinating extinct animals, and we've only really scratched the surface. And if you're interested in the sort of things that were spectacular, were huge and used to live on this earth, then there's a lot more to tell you.
I think when we were making Walking with Dinosaurs and Walking with Beasts, we did kind of wonder what would it be like to have a presenter in there. And one of the amazing things it does is it gives a really good sense of scale. And I think that's one of the biggest values in having actually a person running around with these dinosaurs, is you just think, they're that big, are they? So that's one of the really valuable things. Also, it's someone who's really interested in animals. Nigel is a zoologist. He loves reptiles. And you can just see his enthusiasm, and all of that is just binds the program together.
He's in danger as well, and people can identify with that. He can wrestle with them if they're small enough, and he runs away from them if they're a bit bigger. And it all adds to the things you can communicate to people and the sort of stories you can tell. In Giant Claw, the starting point was a huge claw, bigger than anyone I'd ever seen before. And that belonged to a creature which we didn't feature in Walking with Dinosaurs or Walking with Beasts, that lived and impressed 75 million years ago. So we wanted to make a program about it.
Land of Giants is based pretty much in Argentina 100 million years ago. It was a time when the dinosaurs were the biggest ever. You know, forget T-Rex. The predators then were bigger, and their prey were the biggest animals that have ever walked on Earth. So Nigel goes back to that time, and he wants to actually spectate the biggest hunt to have ever taken place, so the biggest hunt in the history of life. And so he spends his time trying to first of all find out where this massive herd of Argentinosaurus, they're the prey, where they're going to come through, and he wants to be there when they're intercepted by something called Giganotosaurus, and that's the biggest predator ever to walk on land. So in the course of the journey, he has to fly with pterosaurs so he can get a good view of the landscape around him. He nearly gets eaten by a giant crocodile, but eventually he finds this giant herd of Argentinosaurus, and then he watches a hunt. And some of it's going to surprise people.
I think that it's paleontology is a living science, and it's changing all the time, and we want to reflect that. And one of the most exciting aspects, which is shown in giant dinos, is that the whole of the southern hemisphere is comparatively unexplored compared to North America and Europe by scientists. And they keep going out there and finding valleys full of eggs and gigantic bones and things like that. And they're great stories which we can now bring to the public and make real. Giant Claw is basically a quest program, because he's trying to find out who owns this claw, and the claw is about 28 inches long, and he reasons that this must be quite the worst predator that's ever lived, and so he goes hunting for the owner of this claw. To do that, he has to go back to Mongolia 75 million years ago, and he starts off in the desert, and we know that it lived just on the edge of the desert, where there was desert and forest together. And he picks up clues along the way, but in order to do so, he has to get past a lot of animals. He gets chased up a tree by a bunch of velociraptors, which, unlike in Jurassic Park, are not about 15 foot long. They're only about 6 foot long, but they're nasty little predators. He then has to really hide when a Tarbosaurus turns up, which is the Asian cousin of Tyrannosaurus Rex. And eventually he makes his way to a big watering hole where he decides to wait there and wait for the giant claw to turn up. And when the giant claw does turn up, it's a much bigger surprise than he thought. But I can't possibly tell you that. Well, the first shot we did with him, he has swum with sharks, and he has lain down next to alligators and stuck his head in their mouth and never been injured in his life. But the first shoot we went on, which didn't have one animal in it because it was all our computer graphic animals and animatronics, he goes and rips his fingernail off in the first scene, and so presenting us with a real continuity problem, because we had shot a shot in the middle of the show, and we'd shot a bit at the beginning, and then he had to have a bandage around his finger. So we had this bandage that kept on coming on and off for wherever he was meant to be in the programme. But no, otherwise he's a rough, tough fellow, and he usually survives what we throw at him. I think in Nigel's case, it was one of the reasons we chose him. Getting anyone to do that, even a Hollywood actor, is extremely difficult, because you have to feel emotion and focus on, with your right eye line, something that just simply isn't there. And I think if we had chosen, I don't know, Ewan McGregor to do it or whatever, he would have struggled. But Nigel was really enthusiastic, he was really up for it, and also I think he pulled on his own experiences he'd had with tigers and sharks and everything to bring it alive. So when we go close in on his face, you kind of believe it. You believe he's seeing these things. Crossing a field of nesting dinosaurs was tricky with a red flag playing a matador, because there are no animals at all. So he was waving this flag around and trying to be scared as if they were jumping up, trying to grab him. We had to take lots of different size shots for that one so we could cut around it. He actually gets very excited when we eventually pull an animatronic in where he's actually got something to grab, and he wrestled with one dinosaur in our show, and we couldn't stop him. He went on for hours wrestling with, I think he was so desperate to get hold of something.
Where have we been? You went to Australia.
Fraser Island.
I've been to the Canaries, we went into the middle of several Canary Islands, and they're quite astounding. They're beautiful. You know, I'd never really seen what the inland Canaries looks like. I've always seen pictures round about the beach, which is very built up. But inland, it's stunning scenery. And also recently to Egypt, where we wanted to show an extremely barren place, which their desert is very good for. What's interesting about Egypt is that it's famous for its fantastic coral, its wonderfully coloured sea life, and we were going there because we wanted to show a time before half of this coral evolved and when colourful fish weren't really around. So we go to this beautiful diving location and find a little place where actually all the coral had died and all looked a bit old, and we could control what kind of animals were around. But it's wonderful water clarity, and the scene looks very spooky, very nice. With Egypt, I will never forget the heat. It was just unbearable. We were there, we knew Egypt would be a little hot in July. Then, when we start ringing our relatives back in England, they're saying, Egypt's got a massive heat wave at the moment. We realised why we felt quite so bad. You know, this was Egypt at a hot time, having a heat wave. And it's like, 45 degrees outside, and it's just, you can't move. So filming in those conditions was very nasty. I wouldn't want to do that again.
In Fraser Island, I don't know if you remember, but a little boy was killed by a dingo. Also, a man was eaten by sharks just before we went there. And it was a paradise of a place, but it did have sharks, and it had box jellyfish, and it had blue-ringed octopus, and it had death adders, and it had horseflies and mosquitoes and sandflies and black flies. But strangely enough, those, despite all the warning and everything, those didn't bother us too much. So we were lucky, I think, in that respect. I would hope that actually it attracted more people. I mean, Nigel is a charming presenter. He is, you can see he knows what he's talking about, but he has a kind of light charm about him. He's the sort of person you might like to have as a friend. And I think that seeing him wandering amongst the dinosaurs, you can imagine doing it yourself. And I think that's quite important. What all this technology is doing is allowing the audience to imagine what it would be like. Rather than having to look at a book or look at a picture or learn something from somebody, they can just sit there and take it all in. And Nigel helps take you there.
Hello, I'm Nigel Marven, and this is an exquisite reticulated python. I'm a naturalist and I love herpetology, that's the study of reptiles. And just imagine being given the opportunity to go back in time and meet dinosaurs. I've always wanted to work with animals ever since I've been knee-high to a grasshopper. I was never interested in train sets or toy cars. I had stick-in sets, used to have races along the washing line, and my first pet was a green lizard. And it led on naturally from that. I could either have been a vet, but that was working with domesticated animals, or become a scientist. I was never any good at statistics or computing, so the next best thing was to become a wildlife filmmaker. And that has just been wonderful for me. I've travelled all around the world and have to pinch myself sometimes. It's like being paid to do my hobby. And now, actually go from behind the camera to in front, I can get my enthusiasm across when I meet the animals. And this is what I love doing, being very close to gorgeous animals like this. Look at the sheen on the coils of this reticulated python. Beautiful iridescence, just like oil on water. And it's when you get close to animals like this, and it gives the viewers a chance to experience what it's like to have a constricting snake pretty tight around your neck. And Tim Haines, he'd seen me working with modern day reptiles, and he rang me up and said, how do you fancy going back in time to meet dinosaurs? He was responsible for the wondrous Walking with Dinosaurs. And of course I jumped at that opportunity. I was never really going to meet dinosaurs, but the computer generated kind, it was absolutely fantastic. And now when I watch the finished shows, I'm watching it and I think to myself, I can't remember being that close to a velociraptor. It's so real even for me that it actually transports me back 100 million years. I really feel when I see the shows that I'm there back in time with dinosaurs. I've had many adventures in my career meeting gorgeous animals like this. This is a lovely Asian water dragon. And I really didn't think I'd be in any danger at all from a computer-generated dinosaur, but we did have some problems, and this is a really interesting behind-the-scenes story. I was being chased by velociraptors, and I have to climb up this tree, and as I climbed up, I put my finger under a vine. I trod on the vine, and because of that pressure, it actually pulled my fingernail clean from the socket, so it was bleeding really badly. And from that point on, to protect it from infection, I had to have a bandage on my finger. And if you watch the film, it's in The Giant Claw, I have an interaction with a dinosaur, a Mononychus. It's one of the ancestors of the birds. And I say, oh, look, it's bitten or injured my finger, look at the blood on there. But that was actually because it had been pulled out by a vine. And that gave as an excuse to have the bandage on my finger for the rest of the film. But great adventures, going to places where there's no grass, of course. Grass hadn't evolved when dinosaurs were around, so the location teams are always looking for places like that. We went to the wonderful Fraser Island in Australia. There were wild dingoes there, which we saw. You could go to a lovely cliff and look down and see sharks. We did lots of filming in the Red Sea for sea monsters. That was a perfect place to do that. Had to dodge Egyptian military police and things like that, but that was great fun for us. And had some great adventures in Tenerife. That's a wonderful place with the volcanic Mount Tedious. A perfect place for dinosaurs, these big lava covered slopes. And that was where we actually flew a microlight. So we were flying a microlight, and I was turning around and imagining I was being followed by reptiles with a 40-foot wingspan, and I actually believed it. I was so excited, I was shouting at the top of my voice. I could imagine that there was these big pterodactyls flying behind me, and also other wonderful lizards there. There's still lizards that are alive today in Tenerife, and they found a giant one there. It's a very rare lizard. There's only about 100 of them left, and we went to see that on our days off. I love all of the dinosaurs that I met in the programs, but I do have a couple of favourites. One of them, Protoceratops. They were called the sheep of the Cretaceous by paleontologists, and I ran through a big nesting colony, and lizards like this, crocodilians, they're the closest living relatives to the dinosaurs. They can see in colour, so what we used a red flag, and I ran through the colony like a matador, attracting a bull, and that distracted the Protoceratops so I could run through the nesting colony. They've got a very powerful beak, and they could, presumably broken somebody's leg with that beak, so it was good fun pretending I was running through, wending my way through this big nesting colony of dinosaurs. And of course, everyone loves the big predators, and I met 3 of them in the programs. Giganotosaurus, which is a big Argentinian dinosaur, and that fed on the largest dinosaur that ever lived, Argentinosaurus, and that weighed up to 100 tons. So just imagine a carnivore that could eat a dinosaur as big as that. Here's some other guests. These are some baby boa constrictors, these wonderful chestnut markings on the tail, and I know a lot about these. But making the programs, I learned a lot about dinosaurs. And the Walking with Dinosaurs team, they found the most up-to-date paleontological evidence. And this creature, this Therizinosaurus with these giant claws, it is in fact a vegetarian. Great big pot belly, a great fermentation chamber. Takes in lots of leaves, need to digest the cellulose and get the nutrients from the leaves. And they do that by having this big, great vat of stomach acids. And they actually use these claws either for display or maybe for frightening off bigger predators that are after them. So this was a real mystery, and it was great fun for me actually resolving it during the program. And it must be the oddest dinosaur ever known, Therizinosaurus.